Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies, and in this episode, we're going to cover some advanced terrain building skills. We're going to build terrain with removable walls and LED lighting. This is going to be an awesome episode that shows off some skills from the model builder's arsenal that you don't see very often. Let's get to it. Miniature Landscape Hobbies is proudly supported by these sponsors. It has been a long time since I covered a terrain build, and it's been even longer since I covered a building commission. There are a couple reasons for this. First, there have been a veritable horde of new model releases that have kept me busy. Second, I'm very picky about the commissions that I do take. The build for any commissions that I pursue need to both be interesting and engaging, but also a fun challenge. You see, I like to push my limits as a model builder, and when I accept a commission and a client approves my quote, the topic needs to be something novel, or I'm just not interested. This summer, such a job became a distinct possibility when a loyal viewer approached me to make a custom game board for the final confrontation in his long-running D&D campaign. He needed a head-turning environment for the big showdown his players were about to undertake, and he wanted me to make this environment. This sounded pretty fun, but what really interested me were the required specifics. The terrain would need to be more like a functional diorama than a miniature gaming spread. Also, it would need removable walls so the players could easily get at the interior, and it needed something I've never dreamt of building before: a glowing blue magic orb. After some back and forth, the client and I had come to an agreement. I would build a large stone chamber in sort of an addition sign kind of shape, with the orb at the middle for easy access. It would need removable walls and plenty of minor details for visual interest as well. This would be a challenge to build, just what I like, and I had to ensure that it would also be awesome to play on. I was honored to be asked to do this task, so I wasn't going to let this very conscientious dungeon master down, and I wanted his players to have the best time possible. In this video, I'm going to jump in and take you on a step-by-step ride through this build's process. This is a massive project with a ton of component parts and complex elements. Due to this, I'm going to touch on the more advanced and crucial elements that you might be interested in. Out of necessity, I'll be glossing over some of the elements of the build, so if you see anything you would like me to elaborate on, be sure to ask in the comments. With that out of the way, let's get down to building. As a large piece, this project would need a really sturdy base. To start this, I laid out the full dimensions on a section of masonite I had kicking around. It measured 60 centimeters square, so this would inform the general size of the whole project. My client wanted the room in a plus symbol shape, so I ruled out 9 centimeter by 9 centimeter pillars for each corner. The walls needed to be removable, and this posed a real technical challenge. Early on, I decided that I'd use half-inch insulation foam as the main building ingredient. So I ruled out a 1 centimeter border followed by a gap half-inch wide, which is about 14 millimeters. My plan was to slot the walls into the gap between the border and the floor surface to hold them in place. This would provide a sort of socket for holding the walls together. After attaching the square pillars to the walls, this would also help make this fit snug and sturdy. At this point, I must stress that you need to be precise and careful with the measurements in the early stages of a project like this. If a measurement is even slightly off or a line just a little crooked, it could throw off future measurements. Before cutting anything, I also measured out the center of the square base. Starting with my first cut, I made a round hole in the middle of the masonite. Later this would go under the orb, so it will be out of sight, but the hole is necessary to put the wires for the LED wiring through. Moving to a sheet of 1/2-inch insulation foam, I first cut it to the interior dimensions of the base, leaving room for the border and the gap that would form the socket to fit the walls. I also cut a 9 cm by 9 cm piece out of each corner to make space for the pillars that the room would need to have to give it its distinctive addition symbol kind of shape. With wood glue, I now adhered the foam to the masonite in the area I drew out previously for the floor. It was also at this time that I added the border to the base edges to help position the wall socket between this and the foam for the floor. The edges themselves were 1 cm wide strips of masonite fastened down to each edge of the base using wood glue. At this point, I needed to wait for the glue to dry, so I weighed everything down with books and bottles and let it set for a couple of hours. Now seemed like a good time to test my work, so I grabbed a length of 1/2-inch foam to stand in for my wall sections and test fitted it into each of the wall sockets. For the most part, it all fit fine, but here and there, the fit was just a little too tight, so I carefully sanded the foam side until my test fit walls fit neatly. The floor came next, so I ruled out a 1-inch grid on the surface of the foam, which I then scored right into the surface with a scribe. I made sure that the grid was obvious and fairly deep, but not so deep that it caused ragged tears in the foam itself. The beauty of insulation foam is that you can emboss a texture into it, and the best way to do this is to use tinfoil. So I got some tinfoil out and crumpled it into a sausage shape. Then I simply rolled this back and forth on the foam, pushing down firmly into the surface. The result is a pattern strikingly similar to rough stone texture. Flipping the board over, I now located the hole I made near the start of the project and cut this shape through the foam layer above it. Moving to my hot foam cutter, I used the circle attachment to first cut out a circle about 7 centimeters wide. Then I cut into this to make the inside a hollow ring about 6 centimeters in diameter. This will form the plinth for the orb. On the underside of the base, I took some 5mm thick balsa sheets and glued these into the corners of the base. I also added a couple for additional support on either side of the hole. And then felt furniture feet were stuck on top of this. This gave the board some clearance over the table surface that it might sit on, and, of course, it would help protect against any scratches. Now I went on to build the stairs that would lead up to each of the 4 doors in the room. To do this, I got out a compass and ruled 4 20-centimeter semicircles onto 5mm foam core. Then I repeated this with 4 more 16-centimeter semicircles. After I cut these out, I peeled the paper off the surface, exposing the foam underneath. Then I sculpted the stone tiles into the surface itself using a pen. This foam is softer than the insulation foam, so I use a pen here, not a scribe. After this, I used the tinfoil method to match the stone texture to that of the floor. Turning back to the plinth for the orb, I make a 12-centimeter circle out of foam core and sculpt a stone surface into this, just as I did for the steps. I also cut a hole into the center of this to pass the LED wiring through. Now with hot glue, I adhere the plinth to the stone circle, and then I move on to the steps. I glue them together to form 4 sets of 2 steps. After this, I then just go ahead and glue everything down, centering the steps to the middle of each wall section and the plinth over the holes in the middle of the board. To build more texture, I glue fine sand down in patches near the edges of the floor and around the steps. I fix this firmly in place by adding watered down white glue mixed with a little rubbing alcohol over top of this using a pipette. Once the grit has dried, it's time to seal the foam with Mod Podge mixed with black acrylic paint. I do this because it helps in 3 ways. First, this mixture adds strength to the structure. Mod Podge dries rock hard, preventing damage to the game surface. Second, the mixture seals the foam against thinners and spray paints that have chemicals in them that can damage exposed foam, melting it into goo. Third, this helps lay down a primer layer. Once the Mod Podge was dry, I took the base outside and sprayed it matte black with a rattle can. This combined with the Mod Podge and paint mixture and worked as a primer that I could now begin working over top of. When we think of stone, most terrain builders go straight to blue-grays, but this creates a very flat, boring finish on the work. I find it's better to work from a warmer color. So now I got out my airbrush and sprayed the stone areas NATO brown. This was a good start, so now I went to UK light stone, which is a shade of beige. I sprayed this in a cloudy way to build gradients of color in a very uneven capacity. To introduce cool tones, only now I switched to grays. This went on the steps and plinth, layering down medium gray, followed by a light gray. I now give everything a ton of time to dry, as the subsequent layers will be dry brushed, and if the paint's not fully set, the scrubbing action of your brush will destroy the earlier layers. When I was satisfied everything was set, I dry brushed the warmer toned stone with ivory and the gray areas with deck tan. All this dry brushing is great to build texture, but it tends to wash out the deeper contrast. So now I get out the ever so useful AK Interactive flat black paint pen and use it to pick out the gaps and cracks in the floor's stonework. I also do this on the steps and the plinth. I'm not gonna lie, this was a long and tedious process, but it was necessary to restore a sense of contrast to my work, and once it was done, it looked great. In my time, I've scratch-built terrain for everything from plague worlds with rivers of burning vomit to the Ingalls family homestead from Little House on the Prairie, but I've never made a blue magic orb. So I thought to tackle this, I might just improvise. To start, I got out a blue airbrush paint and lightly sprayed a few clumps of cotton batten with it. When I was happy with this, I went to the craft store and bought a hollow plastic Christmas ball and a set of battery-powered LED lights. First, I wrapped the lights in the blue cotton batten and shoved this in the ball. I ran the wires and battery through the holes I cut previously. Then I set the Christmas ornament on the plinth and switched it on. And to my surprise, I had a pretty convincing magic orb. The base and floor of the room was now complete, so I moved on to the walls. First up were the square pillars for the 4 corners. These were simple to make, being cut from 9 cm by 9 cm insulation foam chunks. The pieces I had were 5 cm thick, but I wanted the walls to be 10 cm high, so I cut out 8 pieces and glued one on top of the other. I cut some crypt-like alcoves into 2 sides of each pillar. This was to add some interest. Then I ruled out 15 mm wide lines running horizontally across the face of the inside of each of the pillars. Now I got out a chisel blade for my craft knife and scored and widened the lines to provide seams to make my brickwork. By staggering the placement of these, I made the rough pattern for stone blocks and bricks in the pillar. I finished this off by rolling the aluminum foil over the surface of each pillar to create the stone texture. It was now time to build the walls themselves, so I cut more half-inch insulation foam into the correct lengths to fit the sockets I made previously. And while everything was seated in place, I marked out where the doors would go, and I hot glued a square pillar to the corner of each of the foam walls. This lends weight and extra support to each section, helping the walls fit and stand independently, and also to keep them square and snug to each other and to the floor. Additionally, to prevent warping of the wall structure, I glued lengths of basswood strips to the top of each foam section. Now it was time to go back to my ruler, pen, and chisel blade to sculpt more brickwork into the face of each wall. I won't go into detail on this, as it was the same method I used on the floor and pillars. When the sculpting was done, a 3D printed door is superglued to the middle of each wall section. Preparing for painting the walls was identical to the floor. Everything got the coat of Mod Podge and black paint, and then a primer layer from a black rattle can was applied over this. The color palette for the walls is also identical to that of the floor, though after the walls were dry, things started to differ a little bit. The door got dry brushed gray and then white and painted with speed paints. I won't take you on a step-by-step through the different colors I used, but suffice it to say I decided to keep the scheme in earthy tones with gold metallics for bright contrast. And speaking of contrast, now it was time to line in. I decided that the brickwork would appear more subtle than the floor tiles, so rather than use an AK paint pen to do this, I used a mix of black acrylic ink, black paint, and airbrush flow improver. Then with a fine brush, I traced the gaps in all of the brickwork. Like the floor, this process was time-consuming, but nothing beats the well-lined details to establish volume in your terrain, so I just bit the bullet and got down to business. Things were getting pretty close to the end now, but I felt that there just wasn't enough color, and everything looked a little too clean and neat. So I got out my trusty weathering pencils, wet the tips, and began blobbing on earth, rust, and green tones here and there. These were then blended out with a moist brush to imply grime, streaks, and the buildup of moss or mold on both the wall sections and the floor. All that remained now was to add some 3D printed details, like barrels, skeletons, and torches. And then I went ahead and hit everything with a blast of a couple layers of matte varnish. And with this, finally, the project was done. Now my client has a stone chamber with removable walls and a glowing blue magic orb. Perfect for the ultimate D&D showdown. I'm not too proud to admit that this was a pretty demanding build, taking about 2.5 weeks from start to finish and using substantial combinations of my existing skills and some new ones. In particular, keeping the wall elements square to each other with a fit that was both tight but not so snug that they were still removable took a lot of time. And I was back and forth to the drawing board more times than I would have liked to admit. But despite this, I was pleased with the project for a couple reasons. First, it gave me a real chance to test my skills, and next time I need to do a piece with removable walls, I'll be that much more prepared, freeing up time to experiment with new aspects of the hobby. Second, and most importantly, the client is thrilled with the work. Ultimately, meeting the needs for his gaming group was my major objective. Sparking imagination and creating immersive environments is the real purpose of my art, and I'm extremely happy that this discerning dungeon master is now able to complete his long-running campaign in style. If you'd like to learn how to build Wargaming hills, please consider watching this video. If you'd rather learn about making buildings, please watch this other video instead. Thanks for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, and comment. But most importantly, please remember to keep building life in miniature.